Oh, hey, hi. I know what you're saying. This is not a regular episode, and we were in the middle of kind of a big thing, and something's wrong here. Well, turns out that just about the entire universe has been conspiring to stop Pot Against the Machine from recording for the last couple months, so we're at a little bit of a backlog snafu at the moment. So instead of your regularly scheduled episode, please enjoy this spooky treat that is, a little story machine for the Halloween season. And we will be back again next week with, that big thing that we stopped in the middle of. This isn't Pot Against the Machine. This is the story machine. The story machine slipped. The sky is a haze of purple and orange, and he's taking the bypass through the middle of town at 70, maybe 80. It doesn't feel as fast with no one else on the road, and it's early enough that he's half in a dream anyways. The sort of state where his head can go off on tangents and blend real thoughts with nonsense and make it seem perfectly logical, firing off in a dozen directions until he realizes he hasn't genuinely looked at the road in a long while. Wake up. His eyes dart back to the pavement and lines in a hyper-alert tachypsychic state, making eye contact with the deer as it becomes obvious to both of them that there's no time to do anything about it. In this one infinitely extended moment, he prays in silence, and it feels like paragraphs, years of confessions all saved up, because that's what you have to do, right? If you're genuinely sorry at the end, that's all you need. Never mind the impossibility of dividing genuine remorse from the incentive to, never mind, there's no time for that. The bumper has made contact, and the brakes are engaged and the airbag deployed, and the deer is sliding up the hood and exploding across the highway all at once, and it feels like he hasn't taken a breath in an hour. The windshield cracks in a fractal that looks like a clock face around the spot it hits that deer's skull and expands out from there, and he has one thing he's sorry about. No ulterior motive. Still holding the brakes and now taking a breath, blinded by the airbag and lungs burning from the strange powder that's filled the car, he somehow manages to pull the thing over onto the shoulder so he can sit in silence and listen to his heart pound and try to get some oxygen into his brain. Time passes. The sunrise still hangs in the sky, stubbornly refusing to finish welcoming the day, and the airbag deflates and flops into his lap. He looks down at it, and then at the dashboard. He must have turned off the car at some point. He reaches for his phone, right front pocket, but it's not there. Did he forget it? Does he just sit and wait for someone to come? He sits and waits for someone to come. No one does. No one drives by at all, and minute after minute passes. He stares at nothing straight ahead and never looks back. Nothing to see back there but blood and horror, and his stomach twists just thinking of it. The bypass cuts through the city. There are neighborhoods on either side. There'll be people and phones down there. He sighs and climbs out of the car, never looking back, then climbs over the rail and down the embankment. Through the tall brush and the thicket of trees there, vines hanging over every one, dragging the branches down and sucking the life out of them. There are no birds here. It's quiet for a city, quieter than he thought it would be, but it must still be so early. The sunrise is still coloring the sky. On the other side of the thicket, another empty stretch of highway, 2 lanes of an on-ramp with no one using them. He climbs the rocks up onto the shoulder and crosses without stopping to look, then follows the curve of the road on the other side down to the traffic light. It's bouncing up and down in a wind he hadn't noticed, flashing red at him. No cars in any direction. He crosses the street there, no need to look both ways, no one is out this early, and takes the first cross street on the right to get into the neighborhood proper and away from all the shuttered businesses on the main drag. The buildings there loom directly over the sidewalk, each 4 steps up from the road and 3 or 4 floors tall. They're old brick things with fascinating complex woodwork and stone trim, the layers of peeling paint hanging off of them high overhead, flapping in the ever-present wind, add to the effect. Makes them look more dignified than neglected. Like they're stoic guards holding back the flow of time itself, never faltering, even as they begin to feel its ravages. He shakes his head and rubs his eyes, mind wandering too much for his own good. Who knew an old neighborhood could trigger the imagination like that? He sighs and keeps walking. There has to be a light on somewhere in this city. But there aren't any. Not for a whole block. He stands now in front of a centuries-old church that's set farther back, that gives the street a bit of breathing room. The chunky, mismatched stones that make up the structure twinkle in the orange light, the sun picking up tiny flecks of mineral deposits that likely go unnoticed every other day. There are unkempt hedges along the front and an ancient-looking cemetery with tiny lichen-coated headstones sticking out, leaning this way and that like the neglected teeth of a giant who means to eat this entire city. He can't stop. It's like he never woke up all the way this morning, and the edges of the dream world are creeping into his thoughts, twisting things in directions they wouldn't naturally go and sapping his attention from the task at hand. That's the reason he stopped in the first place. The reason that deer is dead on the highway. The carcass, the wreck, is growing bigger and more graphic in his memory, following him. Death should be enough, in theory, to keep his attention. He clears his throat just to hear a sound, jogs across the next street, and keeps on looking. 2 more houses, no lights, no blurs of motion through the curtains or blinds or unprotected windows. Not here, and not on the other side. So he gives up on the tactic. It must be earlier than he thought. He turns onto the stairs of the 3rd house and climbs them. The doors at the top are unexpectedly huge, fully 10 feet tall, double wide, with flanking windows on each side and matching blue and gold leaf framing. He knocks hard, and both doors shift under his touch, buckling in and bouncing back up. The fist-on-wood pounding, he realizes, interrupts the silence much better than his throat clearing, more than anything has in a long time. There are no car sounds, no chattering people. He doesn't even hear any birds. No one answers the door. He pounds again, even harder this time, and the door on the right pops open and swings inward a few inches. Must not have been locked. He stops and looks back at the street, wondering what made him choose this house, then shakes his head and steps into the tiled foyer. There's a messy stack of mail on the floor on the right, left where it fell yesterday, and the inner doors hang open. He closes the door behind him, it seems only polite, and walks into the house, unsure of what he's even doing here. "Hello?" calls out, and his words bounce through high-ceiling rooms with dark wainscoting and elaborately painted stucco walls. No one answers. He walks farther, into a room with a large grandfather clock facing the front. It stopped, the hands pointed at 11:45 forever. "I was in an accident on the highway. I was wondering if I could use your phone." Still, there's no answer. What is he doing here? Why this house? The only open house, the only empty house, probably the only house without a phone in the entire city. He takes a right through an oversized doorway with a partially closed pocket door and into a stately dining room dominated by a huge table set with 12 chairs. The table, chairs, sideboard, and hutch, every piece of wood in this room matches the wainscoting and the beams across the ceiling perfectly, as if they were all made for each other. He can only imagine the money that went into this place. It seems unfathomable that it would sit open and empty and completely unprotected. The walls here aren't papered. They're covered in an aging yellow tapestry and wide panels, the fabric carefully, invisibly tacked in place and worn thin and delicate. The same few scenes repeat again and again around the circumference of the room. A sun rising, a deer dying on the ground, blood all over a man's hands, a golden door standing open, bones in the dirt, an iron stove yawning open. His breath catches, and he looks down at his hands. He hadn't realized he'd even touched, but he's covered in blood up to his sleeves, running under his sleeves. He rolls them back and finds traces of red and fur nearly to his elbows, all of it drying and sticky. He almost laughs. He can't believe he didn't notice it before. "I'm sorry about the mess. I didn't realize. If I could just use your bathroom, too. I'm so sorry about this. I don't know what's wrong with me today." He's talking to no one, talking just to hear something, to fend off the nervousness that's gripping his insides, that's filling him with a hollow feeling like nausea, but not nausea, like he's a little boy in bed about to fall into a nightmare. "I'll be out of your hair as soon as I can. I just need a sink and a phone. I'm really sorry about all this." He rounds the corner through the back door of the dining room and into a narrow hallway that's lined with shelves and cabinets. There are no windows facing this little space, so it's dark despite the rising sun. The floor squishes and deforms under his feet. It looks to be multiple ill-fitting layers of tile stacked on top of one another, each visible through gaps and holes in the layers above them. This stands in stark contrast to the careful beauty of the front rooms and serves as a sort of transition to the back of the house, where there will be a sink, he assumes. He follows the hallway into the end and turns 90 degrees into the kitchen at the back, and then he understands. The kitchen is a construction site. The floorboards have been pulled up and removed, leaving only the joists that run front to back in the huge room floating a few feet above the sandy dirt floor below. The windows that should fill this place with light are gone as well, holes in the back of the house covered by semi-opaque layers of thick plastic sheeting that have been carelessly stapled into the wood, filtering the early morning light to fill the space with a sickly, flesh-like color. Tools lie in the dirt, scattered throughout the space, evidence of recent work. The kitchen wall closest to him, closest to the front of the house, is coated with recessed cabinets and drawers and appliances. These, at least, have not been removed for the remodel. There's a huge commercial refrigerator towering over the room in its uninterrupted shining steel and splitting the counters in half. Beyond that, a kitchen sink and a phone hanging on the wall, his salvation at the far end of the room. The owners aren't here. Surely they won't mind if he does what he needs to and then leaves this place forever. Balancing carefully, he steps from joist to joist across the room. The spaces between them are not uniform, as they would be in modern construction, but assembled haphazardly, as if they were an afterthought. In places they sag and bow and twist. The floor in this room had almost certainly buckled before they ripped it up. In his head, he watches wide-plank hardwood flooring flowing up and down like waves on the ocean, carrying him across to the sink. He is merely a boat, adrift, floating on a sea of wood, hoping to drop anchor at the sink and get all of this goddamn deer blood off of his arms. He remembers something as he turns the water on, touching his face, touching the highway divider, touching any number of things on his way here, and never leaving blood behind. His hands are already clean. His sleeves are rolled up for no reason. He never touched that deer, never even looked back at it. He keeps washing his hands regardless, because in his head the blood is going to creep back over him the moment he lets down his guard. Why did he come to this house? Who was he even going to call? There's no towel at the sink, so he dries his bloodless hands on his shirt. Oh no! A tiny, high-pitched voice says from behind him, somewhere below, and the surprise makes him jump, makes him turn around to look too quickly without thinking. He steps off the joists and twists, trying to put his foot down again where a logical step would take it, but he finds no ground. Even as his body swings, he stumbles and twists, dropping down to the dirt floor below as his one leg tries to keep him up. It's wrenched horribly in the process, and the back of his head bounces off the cabinets on the way down, and when he lands on one leg in the uneven dirt, stunned, his ankle rolls and what little base he had falls out from under him. He tumbles down to his knees, wet hands sinking into the dirt as a cloud of dust kicks up around him. He feels tiny, hard things below the surface of the dirt, like animal bones, his ears ringing from the thump on the back of the head. The recoil is instinctive. He jolts back too far at once, sees the person standing before him, and falls back over his own feet. She's looking down at him, skin stretched thin and gray, literally gray over bones, with sunken cheeks and wide, dry eyes, her white hair thin and wild. This old woman standing over him in the dirt is wearing a dirty house dress, stooped over as if the weight of the floral-patterned thing is too much for her back. Her voice is just above a whisper, an ancient, cracked thing that she seems to struggle to produce at all. "You've slipped." Her words help him ground himself in this moment, at least. He can see in the corner of his eye that the blood has returned to his arms, a pattern of dark red underlying the caked-on brown dirt. But he can't. He doesn't have time. "Yes, I'm sorry. I was trying to wash, and I forgot. I know I shouldn't have walked in, but your door was open. I tried calling. I had an accident, you see, up on the highway, and I don't have my phone, and I was looking for one so he could what?" He realizes quite suddenly that he had no idea who he would call if he'd had a phone. Who was there, really? He isn't even sure he'd ever wanted a phone in the first place. It seemed like it was just an assumption that one made when one had an accident. "I can't help you," she says, after his apologies die away, and shifts her weight carefully from foot to foot, taking tiny steps to turn herself around. The process is agonizingly slow. He can't imagine how she managed to sneak up on him. She must have been in the room the whole time and he'd simply missed her, and she was so quiet that, even if she'd responded, he probably wouldn't have heard her. A simple misunderstanding. She begins shuffling toward the back of the kitchen where the plastic-covered windows sit. This way, this way." He pushes himself up, leaving spots of blood and dirt on the joists as he does, and exposing piles of rodent bones as he pulls himself out of the dust. They're all around him, arranged in spiraling fractal patterns like broken glass, like they've been left there deliberately. He wonders if, beneath each house, is a bed of death just waiting to be exposed. Somehow, the old woman is already across the room, 2 joists over. He's surprised that she, given the tiny steps that she takes, could climb over them so fast. There's nothing to do but follow and apologize. "I really am sorry about this. I don't know what I was thinking. My head's been all over the place today, and with the accident, really, I should just get out of your hair." "Nonsense," she says, and pulls the door open at the back of the room. There hadn't been a door there, had there? Of course there had. You couldn't just add a door. It was just strange that he hadn't noticed it before. Strange, also, that it sat down below the level of the old floor, like it was built for this room after it was torn apart. Stranger still that, despite the glowing windows that flanked it, the door didn't seem to lead outside. "Do stay close. There isn't much time." And she steps forward into the darkened corridor beyond. It's a stairwell, apparently, heading down out the back of the house. She's moving with more urgency now and seems a bit more vital than she had before, as if buoyed by their short journey across the room. He follows her over the joists and through the door and down the stairs, too confused to... And then he stops. On the 4th stair above the bottom, in near total darkness, looking down at this ancient woman as she fumbles with the lock to a heavy steel cellar door. As soon as he thinks to ask the question, it's all he can think of. "Where are you taking me?" "Never mind," she says, her voice louder and stronger than before. "Come along." The key in the door makes a resounding click, and the way to never mind is open. "I will not," he says. "There's death in the dirt. There's death below the ground. He's sure of it. I'm leaving. There's no reason for me to be here. No reason for me to follow you into some bomb shelter or whatever that is. I'm sorry that I walked into your house. I'm sorry that I made a mess, but I'm leaving. Goodbye." She stops, the door half open, and looks up at him. The skin on her face isn't pulled nearly so tight as before. It must have been a trick of that strange morning light from the other room. "There's no time for this. You will follow me now. You've already wasted what little you had." "I'm not going anywhere with you," he says as he turns to walk back up the stairs. A hand grabs his wrist. It squeezes hard enough to hurt. She's right behind him, even though they'd been 4 stairs apart a second before. "You've slipped between the seconds. There is nowhere but here. It's almost too late to bring you out the other side." Up and above, the grandfather clock chimes once. His heart thuds with it. Death sits at the bottom of those stairs. He doesn't know why he knows that, but he's sure. "Let go of me. You're not making any sense. None of this makes any sense. I'm walking away now. If you try to follow me, I will call the police." He pulls his arm away and rushes up the stairs, stepping through the door onto the hardwood floor beyond, directly into the dining room. He stops. The door didn't, and he hadn't, and the dirt in the kitchen, and there she is, sitting at the head of the table, her dress clean, fork and knife in her hands, watching him with those sunken eyes. The grandfather clock chimes again. There are others at the table now, sitting in almost all 12 seats. An ancient man, hunched over his plate and nearly drifting off to sleep in his chair. A strange person. No, not a person. He has to blink, to shake his head, to look away. Why is there a deer at the table? It's dead, obviously, stuffed by the look of it, glass eyes pointed at him in cruel mockery. The other chairs he sees now are not filled with people at all, but with teeming masses of rodents that scramble over one another in constantly shifting piles. He glances down, shaking his head, backing away, and sees a flash, dirt strewn with tiny bones all around him, his hands covered in blood. Is he still? He looks up and sees for certain that the woman at the table, who was slicing off large pieces of an undercooked steak, is not the one he'd seen in the kitchen. Her daughter, maybe. He steps back, bumps into the doorway, and turns, knowing time is running out, knowing the rodents are scrambling down the sides of the chairs and rushing over, brushing by his ankles, and there she is again. She doesn't look angry, though, even though he's defied her. This ancient, inscrutable woman shakes her head sadly as she stares up at him. "I'm very sorry, young man. You've wasted all of your time." He's sitting in the driver's seat of his car, staring out at the sunrise as the deer's face rushes towards him and blood sprays over the street, glistening in the orange light. He's sitting at the dining room table, staring down at a cut of meat, short brown fur matted to the sides in patches, the smell of burnt hair in the air. He's kneeling in the dirt, covered in blood, out in the middle of an empty street in an empty city in an empty world. He can feel the glass eyes of hundreds of people watching him, but he doesn't see anyone. They've left him all alone. But he isn't really alone. He's staring into the eyes of this woman, pitying her, and there are others behind her he can't quite see. Everything has changed. "What have you done to me?" She takes both of his hands in hers and begins backing into the deteriorating hallway, her eyes fixed on his and unblinking. As the two of them move into this narrow space, the others behind her reach over her shoulders and place their hands on his wrists, then his forearms and on up, until still more close in behind him grip his shoulders and push him forward, but always gently. He's wasted his time. They're all together now. She never turns away. "You've fallen between the seconds, into the place that does not exist. I'm afraid you're trapped here with us, dear. But don't worry. We'll take care of you." After a much longer walk, much too long through the maze of corridors and shadows, the seemingly endless crowd of ancient people leads him out into the kitchen, a second kitchen, where a huge enameled iron oven sits open, heating the air all around to uncomfortable levels, waiting to be fed. And they draw him toward this towering appliance, with her holding eye contact all along, keeping him from looking into the flames. "I don't understand," he says, with panic creeping into his voice. "You haven't explained anything. Why am I here? What is this place? Where are we going? Where were we going?" As he asks these questions, he loses sight of her, of the kitchen, of the house. He's on his knees on the pavement, hunched over the corpse of a deer that has been torn to pieces by knives and forks that weigh thousands of pounds. He buries his arms into its shattered ribcage almost up to the elbows. They disappear into the viscera, but all he feels inside is dirt. He tells himself that this isn't real. He can still feel the heat, and he tells himself that that isn't real either. He shakes his head. "I've fallen asleep. None of this is real." She smiles as they reach the oven, which towers over all of the shrunken elderly people who have herded him into place, stands even taller than he does, and the heat of the thing is incredible. The most intense, most vivid feeling he can remember, as if every sensation before this moment, every sensation of his entire life, has been an imitation of the real. Where had he been going? "Perhaps it's easier if you believe that," she says as they begin to push once more toward the belly of the oven, "at least until it's over." His eyes stretch open wide now. He can see half a dozen different scenes all at once, a small army of different iterations of the same moments, but in all of them his hands drip with blood and the air burns even to breathe, and he feels this inexorable push backwards. There are so many of them. Why are they in such a hurry? "Wait!" His voice is desperate. He feels the searing hot metal on his back, burning through his shirt, eating away the top layers of his skin, and panic sets in. He can't focus on the kitchen, can barely find the source of his pain through all the different pictures he sees, and so he screams into as many of them as he can. "You don't have to do this! I'm sorry I came here. I don't know what came over me. I don't need any answers. I don't need anything from you. Just please let me go. I'll give you anything in my power to give." "And so you shall," says the tiny old lady, her grip on his hands tightening, her nearly exposed bones digging into his skin. She pushes again. They all do. "We eat so rarely, young man. I tried to spare you this." 100 hands drive him over backwards, laying him across the metal door that nearly glows with heat. He can hear his flesh sizzle even over the sound of his screams. "We will speak again after dinner. You will understand much better then." As they slide him back across the door and into the gigantic cavern-like oven, and he twists and screams with all the wild strength he can find, he stares into the glass eyes of the deer and all of his captors as they slide up the hood of his car, their fur and dresses turning to char, flesh sizzling as they rocket past. He sees the glow of the sunrise all around him. He feels the tiny bones of 100 underfed rodents running around him, tearing through the walls of his body and diving into the flames in fractal patterns that expand forever. The grandfather clock chimes one more time, and he stops screaming. 100 years later, he sits at the dining room table, stooped with impossible age, staring down into a piece of meat. They eat so rarely in this place. It's good to have a nice dinner.